second plenary speaker, Dr. Ursula Wingate, who's a reader in language education at King's College London. I think it's safe to say she's been a really influential figure in EAP for some time now. I know she's had a huge influence on my own thinking about EAP and my own practice. She's known for her genre-based approaches to literacy instruction, but perhaps more particularly for the very strong case she makes for collaborative practice between academic literacy specialists, EAP, and academics within the disciplines. And here I have to say that I really do continue to dip into her work, read about it, think about it. In fact, I stole this book, Academic Literacy and Student Diversity, The Case for Inclusive Practice, from my colleague Carol McDermott, or as I like to say, I have borrowed it indefinitely, because every time I think about putting it back on her desk, I find I want to read another section and think about it. So Ursula has had a real powerful and enduring impact on how I work, and I'm sure that's the case for many of you. Intriguingly, Ursula is going to speak to us today about reintroducing the process approach into EAP teaching. So I'm really, really looking forward to hearing about that. So yes, over to you, Ursula, and thank you so much.
Thank you for your kind introduction, Annalie. And I start as soon as I've managed to call up my PowerPoint. Can you all see it? Yeah, is it visible? Okay. So first I want to say thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak at the Bali 2021 conference. When I accepted the invitation, I pictured myself in a glamorous lecture hall at Glasgow University in front of an audience I could actually see. As it turns out, I'm sitting in my study, as I have been doing for the last 13 months, but there we are, and we'll make the most of it. So the conference theme is exploring pedagogical approaches in EAP teaching. I address this theme by taking a look at the process approach to teaching writing, an approach that was popular in the 1980s and 90s and widely used in the North American college composition context. I will argue that EAP teachers should include the process approach into their pedagogic repertoire. The conference aim, as stated on the website, is to consider appropriate pedagogies for teaching EAP in different contexts at different levels. So different levels are very much on my agenda for today, as I will present research conducted with undergraduate students as well as native English speaker students. For too long, it seems to me, has EAP been preoccupied with postgraduate non-native speaker students studying in Anglophone institutions. However, with the ever-growing EMI programs in universities around the world, EAP practitioners will increasingly have to deal with undergraduates with quite different levels of language proficiency as well as writing experience. And as EAP is gradually moving forward to a more inclusive provision, native English speaker students who are like their international counterparts, non-native speakers of academic English, will increasingly belong to the EAP practitioners' clientele. So lastly, one of the questions raised on the conference website was, does EAP have a signature pedagogy? I would say yes, it has, and that's genre pedagogy. And I want to argue today that EAP might have been too focused on genre at the cost of other approaches, and that therefore some student needs may have been neglected. So before I make my case, I first introduce the original process model by Flower and Hayes. So when this model was proposed, in the early 1980s, it was quite a novelty. It was based on retro and introspective research that helped to reveal the processes and strategies writers engage with during text production. The model moved away from the prevalent belief that writing is a linear process with its stages plan, write, edit, and recognized that the main processes of planning, writing, and reviewing are used recursively. The process also placed attention on the writing behaviors of individual writers. This marked a clear departure from the product approach that was only concerned with the accuracy of the final product, the text. So the model describes writing as an interaction of three main processes: planning, translating, this is the actual writing, and reviewing. And these processes are coordinated by the monitor. Their use is influenced by the task environment and the writer's long-term memory. Note that the model as such is inadequate for academic writing, where writers don't write from long-term memory. I'll show you later how we adapted it for the investigation of academic writing. An important contribution of process research was the identification of differences between expert and novice writers. Expert writers conduct global planning, which involves setting clear goals, developing comprehensive outlines and plans. Local planning, typical for inexperienced writers, is planning on the spot. So I think I've just written this sentence now, what shall I write next? A big difference lies in the allocation to the time allocation to the different processes. Experts devote more time to planning and reviewing. Novices allocate far more time to writing. Expert writers also revise more at the discourse level, while inexperienced writers revise at the sentence level and are concerned with surface features such as grammar and spelling. These differences have been found consistently in both L1 and L2 studies. As I have already said, Flower and Hayes' model led to the recognition that text production is not linear, but involves a lot of going back and forth in the evolving text, discovering new ideas, changing the original plan, and reviewing what has already been written. These processes are important for the production of a good text, and therefore it's the role of the teacher to raise students' awareness of these processes, their recursiveness, and their effective use. In traditional process teaching, writing was done in the classroom, and the teacher monitored and facilitated the use of processes. Process approaches were heavily criticized by genre proponents, particularly one branch which saw writing as a means of developing creativity, fluency, self-discovery, and personal growth, and more or less ignored content and accuracy. This branch was accused by Hyland as being ego-centered and theoretical. A kind of genre versus process debate took place in the early 1990s. Genre scholars accused process approaches of neglecting text analysis, of not considering the social and communicative purposes of specific genres or the expectations of the audience, and of not teaching the linguistic and structural features expected in specific genres. Process proponents, on the other hand, associated genre with a prescriptive teaching model. The two approaches were seen as mutually exclusive. when in fact students need both, and both should be taught in a complementary fashion, as I will argue today. I'm now beginning to make the case for integrating the process approach into EAP teaching. The first argument is that, as Beaufort found in her studies of academic and professional writers, writing process knowledge is one of the 5 knowledge domains that expert writers draw on. The problem with EAP pedagogies is that they look more or less at genre knowledge, perhaps rhetorical knowledge, perhaps a bit of discourse community knowledge, but writing process knowledge seems to be largely neglected. So there are 3 main types, or there are 3 types of problems novice writers tend to have with the writing processes, which make it necessary to attend to process used in the EAP classroom. First, as I've already said, previous studies have shown that inexperienced writers allocate most of their time to the actual writing without recognizing the importance of planning and reviewing. This is related to their lack of understanding of the functions of planning and reviewing, which, as I will show later, are highly important for the development of argument. In academic writing, one important process which is not considered in the Flower and Hayes model is the use of sources. This process involves searching for relevant sources, evaluating them for relevant information, and integrating this information in the text. EAP does not currently pay enough attention to this process, which is arguably the most difficult one for novice academic writers. Next, I will show you which kind of data I collected in my research into process used by novice writers, because I'm drawing on this data to make my case. So recently I administered a 10-item questionnaire to our own first-year BA and one cohort of MA students, and the return rate for both groups was over 50%. Among other questions, I wanted to find out how they allocate their time to the different processes, whether they had received instruction on process use, and whether they felt they would have benefited from instruction. The multi-method study was conducted in collaboration with Rowena Harper from Edith Cowan University in Perth and funded by the Australian government. We investigated the writing behaviours of 13 undergraduate students from 4 academic disciplines: applied linguistics, political science, tourist and event management, and chemistry at an Australian and a UK university. We monitored the students from shortly before they began writing their first assignment until the point when they had received feedback. The main data source for investigating their process use were screen recordings of all the assignment-related activities carried out on the computer. We used the Flower and Hayes model as theoretical framework and as a framework for the analysis of the screen recording data. In the next slide, I show you how we adapted the model for academic writing. The original model was developed in the pre-computer and pre-internet era, when texts were produced with pen and paper and without intermediate access to unlimited internet resources. The model was based on short writing tasks in which the writers relied on their long-term memory to retrieve relevant information. So you remember the box on the left was called the writer's long-term memory. Academic writing, by contrast, is evidence-based, and writers don't retrieve much information from the long-term memory, but from external resources, such as academic texts. Almost all resources, apart from some books, are accessed via the internet, and many are consulted during text production. This means that consulting resources is a fourth process, typical for academic writing, that is intertwined with the other three processes. So from our data, we could see what kind of online resources students consult during text production. So the first one, for instance, is course documentation, course sites including lecture materials, reading lists, PDFs, and assignment instructions. And I will not explain every single one in the list. So I will now report our findings according to the three areas I mentioned earlier as being problematic: time allocation, understanding the functions of planning and reviewing, and source use. So in my research, I was interested in whether MA students, being more experienced writers, allocate more time to planning and reviewing than BA students. So I first compared their reported time allocation and then compared this with the ones identified in our screen recordings. Students were asked about the percentage of time they devote to the three main processes. It was explained in the questionnaire that planning should include searching for sources, but should exclude the reading of them. The process of reviewing was explained by revising and editing the text. We can see here that a considerable majority of time is spent on the actual writing process, particularly among the BA students, which is in line with what previous students have found to be the case for inexperienced writers. As you can see, the more experienced writers, the MA students, spend more time on planning and less on writing. However, the time allocated to writing is still a lot. Also, there was considerable variation, as you can see in the standard deviations. What is striking, though, and of concern, is the low percentage of time spent by both groups on reviewing. However, the results shown here more or less represent students' perceptions, or perhaps the time the students think should be devoted to these processes. They do not adequately reflect what's going on in real writing, as there are many other activities happening in the real writing process. To get a more realistic picture, we now look at findings from the screen recordings. We see here the time allocation of a successful writer, Jess, a student of chemistry, who gained a high grade for a literature review, and an unsuccessful writer, Ellen, who got the lowest pass grade for her essay in applied linguistics. I'll show you later how we calculated their time allocations. As we were analyzing real academic writing, we had to include the additional process of consulting resources, on which students spend quite a lot of time. Please note that the percentages here do not add up to 100, as there are many other things going on during text production, such as pauses or technical problems. Obvious here is that the successful student, Jess, spent a similar amount of time on the main processes of planning, writing, and reviewing. This was the trend among all successful students in our cohort. Several, as Jess in this example, spent even less time on writing than on planning and reviewing. In any case, the time devoted to writing is much lower than that reported by the BA and MA students. Looking at the unsuccessful writer, Ellen, we see that she did not spend any time on planning. She did not produce an essay plan or any notes, and she did not read sources before she started writing. She spent more time on writing and less time on reviewing than the successful student. Most striking is the high percentage of time she spent on consulting resources, and I come back to this behavior later. So looking at the time allocation of Jess, the successful student, and comparing it with what the BA and MA students reported, it seems that many students are not sufficiently aware of the relatively high amount of time that good writers devote to planning and reviewing. This suggests that effective time allocation should be addressed in the EAP classroom. And now we look at the second problem area, students' understanding of the functions of planning and reviewing. But first, I want to show you the responses to another questionnaire item, which provided a list of areas in which the students could indicate whether they would have benefited from training. I show here only the questions related to planning and reviewing. As you can see, a high percentage of BA students felt they need training in organizing the notes from their sources and in developing an assignment plan. A substantial number of MA students felt they would have benefited from training in developing an assignment plan and in revising their text effectively. So, having established that there is obviously a perceived need for instruction in planning and reviewing among both inexperienced and more experienced writers, I will now show examples of the planning and reviewing by successful students in our sample and discuss the function of these processes. So first, for the successful students in our sample, planning took more than 20% of the overall text production time and was a clear and separate process at the beginning of text production. This planning document shows one function of planning, the setting of goals. Fatima, who received a high distinction grade for her literature review in chemistry, wrote this outline and time schedule as her first planning document. First, we look at the outline. Fatima told us that thinking about the reader enabled her to set writing goals. She planned her assignment like a story for the reader, and this story is reflected in the outline. The topic was the need for new antibiotics, and the main headings tell the story step by step, from how antibiotics work to how resistance occurs to ways to tackle this issue. As can be seen in the screenshot, she also drew up an exact time plan with specific dates for each part of the assignment. Once she completed a part, she crossed it out. Goal setting is an important function of planning. It includes the careful analysis of the assignment task, thinking of reader expectations, and outlining content in a way that addresses these expectations. Clear goals later guide the reviewing processes and make them more purposeful. So, let's have a look at the planning document of another successful writer, Gina, a political science student who had spent the first 1.5 sessions of her overall 11 text production sessions on developing a comprehensive essay plan, which you can see on the left. Gina had read several relevant chapters before planning. During planning, Gina consulted these chapters for specific information she needed for her argument. At the end of the planning phase, Gina had produced a 2-page planning document that contained the headings as well as the content for each paragraph in bullet points. The headings reflect precisely her line of argument. For instance, main point 1, counter-argument, or main point 2, refutations of counter-argument. The bullet points specified the claims that would form the argument and often had a note to self format, for instance, argue against the morals of a strong state. Another function of planning is integrating information gained from sources into the plan. Gina's plan ended with a section entitled Books to Reference, Notes on Said Books, and I'll show you later how she integrated source information there. The comprehensive plan meant that Gina had her line of argument prepared before she began the actual writing. She had the plan open next to the emerging text during most of text production. Before I talk about the functions of reviewing, I first want to take a brief look at the time allocation to these processes by 2 successful and an unsuccessful student, as well as the patterns of their usage. So reviewing in our adaptation of the model consists of 3 sub-processes. Evaluating means that the writer scrolls up and down, reading and rereading the whole or parts of the text, but makes no changes to the draft. Evaluating often triggers the other 2 sub-processes, revising or editing. Revising means that the writer deletes and rewrites, making sometimes substantial changes to the content of the text. Editing is often facilitated by writing tools such as Grammarly. This sub-process contains activities such as formatting, correcting small errors, and adding or changing punctuation. As you can see, Gina spent the largest amount of time on reviewing, as well as on the sub-process of revising. The weak student, Ellen, spent the shortest time on reviewing and hardly any on revising. As I'll show next, for successful students, revising and editing are ongoing and recursive processes that are intertwined with writing, or we call it formulating in our study, while unsuccessful writers only revise and edit at the end of the text production. So here you might first be a little bit confused. This is the coding rubric we use to measure time allocation and the interaction of process use. You will see on the left, in the left column, is our adapted process model with the categories consulting resources, planning, composing, and reviewing, imported into Excel sheets. The time spent on each sub-process was recorded in the relevant row in sequential order. So each writing session was coded in a designated Excel sheet so that the time allocation to the different processes could then at the end be added up and the percentage could be calculated. For the analysis, the row for formulating, that's what we call the actual writing, was highlighted in yellow to explore more easily how this process, found to be dominant in earlier research, interacted with and was facilitated by the use of other processes. The example here presents 10 minutes from Gina's 5th writing session. Gina's typical process interaction shows that relatively short writing phases are constantly preceded and followed by the reviewing processes. For example, the first and longest formulating phase of 1.7 minutes is followed by 3.4 minutes of engagement with the reviewing processes, of which the longest is revising with 1.7 minutes. In summary, in successful writers, the actual writing of formulating is closely intertwined with reviewing, and the reviewing processes tend to take up more time than formulating. So here we see a completely different pattern, which is typical for Alan's and other weak students' text production. We know from the earlier table that Alan spent little time on reviewing. She did some editing at the very end, but she hardly revised her text. This 11.5-minute extract from Alan's second session shows that her formulating was interspersed by frequent consultations of course documentation and information searches. You see that here. She constantly referred back to the essay instructions and frequently searched Google for information on loanwords in English, the topic she had chosen. The information she traced was often irrelevant to her topic. Her searches were mainly concerned with finding instructions in the course documentation and ideas about what to write in her unplanned essay. Before we look closer at Alan's use of sources, I want to show you in an extract from Gina's text what the main functions of revising, the arguably most important sub-process of reviewing, are. So now it gets really tricky. And if you can't see this very well, I talk you through, but I will submit the PowerPoints, and if you wish, you can have a close-up look later. This is the second paragraph of Gina's essay, entitled in her plan, Main Point 1 Counter-Argument. In this paragraph, I annotated all the revisions. Gina completed the first part of this paragraph in session 3 and the whole paragraph in session 4. She began session 4 with the revision of the first part, deleting the last sentence. All changes made in session 4 are here annotated in red. And a lot of revisions were made while Gina was writing this paragraph, which is in line with the reviewing pattern that I've shown you in the Excel coding sheet. However, what is important is that Gina came back to this paragraph in all the following sessions, apart from the very last one, session 11. In session 5, annotated in blue, she evaluated the paragraph 4 times and made 1 addition. In session 6, she only evaluated and edited the paragraph, going back to it 3 times. In session 7, it's hard for me to find, marked in purple, she made further changes and additions, one of which was removed and then replaced again in session 8, annotated in yellow. In session 9, marked in session, can't remember, which we see at marked in green, sorry, we see that here. She finally, she added her thesis statement, which you see at the bottom. Throughout this essay, I will argue, and so on, which she then completed in session 10. This is remarkable because it shows how Gina uses revising to create coherence in her overall text. Only after she had written the remaining 5 paragraphs of her essay, she felt ready to make her thesis statement at a point when she exactly knew which route her argument had taken. While one main function of the overall reviewing process is presenting the text in an acceptable format, we can identify several functions of the sub-process of revising. The first one, the main function of which is refining the argument. The first one, which you see here or probably don't see at arrow 1, is improving the wording of an argument or point by replacing words and phrases. Here she replaces makes by performs. The second function is completing a certain claim about which the writer was initially not clear and left notes in brackets, like come back to this point. The third function is making the argument stronger or more poignant through rephrasing it. You see here at arrow 3, where she replaces the expression because they have their resources confiscated with a stronger expression because of the injustice when resources are confiscated. Lastly, at the bottom, arrow 4, the fourth and perhaps most important function is ensuring coherence in the overall text. That was the point with her thesis statement. I'm coming now to the last problem area, source use. Source use, also called the reading to write process, is what tends to be neglected in genre approaches, a point that was strongly made by Teresa Dovey, who states that the key academic activity of reading to write has been largely relegated to the analysis of target genres. According to Dovey, genre approaches are good for ad hoc workshops and short intensive EAP courses. However, when preparing students for extended writing tasks, she claims that explicit teaching of the processes of source use, the sub-processes of source use, is essential. So let's have a look how successful and unsuccessful students use sources. Often first-year undergraduate students can rely on their reading lists to find relevant literature. The chemistry students in our sample, however, had to find their own literature for the topic they had chosen. Jess, in this example, uses Google Scholar with the keyword antibiotic resistance, but she came across a lot of literature that she found less relevant. She then attended a library course on the use of science databases, started a new search in the Web of Science database, and found much more relevant articles. Here you see how systematically the sources were arranged. First, some of the PDFs were given names that referred to their content rather than provided the author's names. This facilitated Jessie's quick and easy recollection of the content of these articles. Later, she created a subfolder, Useful, where she put all the articles to which she most referred. And here is a second example of a successful student. After the outline, Gina produced a long section that I already mentioned, books to reference, notes on said books. You see the first part of this section here. For each of the 3 chapters she had read before, she wrote systematic notes that supported her line of argument. To prepare for the integration of this information into her essay, she included page numbers. I pointed this out by the arrow, and direct citations from her sources. And now, sorry, I'm just trying to go down. So now comes what should have been the real treat for the audience, an extract from a video clip from our screen recordings. However, yesterday, after half a day of experimenting with Zoom, I found that I could not share this link with the audience. The clip would appear on my screen, but not the audience's screen. So I will talk you through this episode of Ellen's source use, but I will provide the clip later together with my slides to the conference organizers. So if you are interested, you can have a look at this exciting video clip. So we know already that Ellen had not produced any planning documents. When the search begins, Ellen's essay document is almost empty. She had pasted the formatting guidelines into the top and then typed a single word as her title, loan words. Then she begins her search in Google Scholar with the extremely general keyword words. This leads her to a book entitled Words and Things that bears no relation to the topic of loan words. Nevertheless, she spends a bit of time browsing in it. She then starts a new search in Google Scholar with the key phrase, pronunciation of foreign words. She might by now have decided that she is interested in the pronunciation of loan words. Having not found anything helpful, she repeats the search in general Google. This calls up a lot of popular as well as irrelevant stuff, such as pronunciation guides on YouTube. Not finding anything relevant there, but what is relevant when you don't know what you are looking for? She refines the same search by adding article. So then she ends up with an anecdotal, jokey piece in the American Scholar, a popular magazine, and she spends quite a lot of time on reading it. So here and in many other search episodes, Ellen was trying to find ideas on what to write, rather than looking for evidence for specific claims that would build an argument. So, the examples have shown that some students are obviously capable of using the writing processes effectively. However, it is likely that many novice students are in a similar position as Ellen, being unaware of the process use required in academic writing, and therefore continuing with writing practices that they might have used in secondary school, namely writing spontaneously and unplanned. For these students, it is important that EAP programs help students to manage effective process use. This requires the following analyzing and modeling activities. First, appropriate time allocation should be addressed in the classroom. Students should be given information about how much time successful and unsuccessful writers spend on the various processes. They should be encouraged to measure their own time allocation, for instance, through screen recording, and reflect on it. By the way, I'll be finished in 4 minutes, just in case the conference organizers get a bit nervous. It's only one more slide to come. Next, the interaction of processes in successful academic writing should be analyzed. Students should be made aware of the fact that the writing processes are recursive and constantly interact with each other. This could be done by asking students to analyze the Excel sheets that I have shown you of Gina and Ellen's process use, or look at some screen recordings of writing in action. An important learning point here is that successful students don't just review their text at the end of the composition period, but that reviewing constantly interacts with writing. Again, a very effective method would be to ask the students to produce a screen recording of their own writing sessions and analyze them for process use. Third, the analysis of planning documents is important. While most writing guides alert students to the need of planning, they might not provide sufficient detail about what a good assignment plan looks like. Therefore, instead of only analyzing the product, we should also analyze planning documents that lead to the product. This would help students understand that a good essay plan outlines the structure and the main points of the argument and includes systematic notes from the sources. Next, the functions of revising should be addressed in the EAP classroom. Revising is probably the most important sub-process for text presentation and coherence. Therefore, the 4 functions of revising should be identified in teaching activities. It is critical for students to realize that revising means going back to earlier parts of the text again and again to improve individual arguments and bring them into line with later ones. Finally, and ideally, for novice students writing their first assignment, source use should be modeled in the EAP classroom. This would mean that for one assignment topic, the EAP practitioner would accompany students through the steps of identifying, evaluating, and integrating information from sources into their text. For all these activities, it is useful to collect materials of the type I've shown you: planning documents, drafts, and screen recordings. So, in my talk, I did not have the intention to belittle genre models for teaching academic literacy, of which I'm a proponent myself. My aim was to raise awareness of the fact that we neglect student needs if we only analyze genre, the product of writing, without dealing with the processes by which the product was completed. I propose, therefore, that both process and genre should be addressed in the EAP classroom. However, this cannot be achieved in a generic fashion. I've long been arguing for a collaborative and discipline-specific approach in which EAP specialists collaborate with academics in the disciplines to develop students' academic literacy. This approach is even more important when a focus on writing processes is included into EAP pedagogy, as we cannot teach process use in detachment from the actual assignments that students have to produce. Including a process approach means that we extend our teaching program to help students with the activities that precede writing, such as source use or planning, and therefore addressing student needs that are neglected by genre models. We can then claim that we are teaching academic literacy rather than academic writing. How can this be achieved in practice? It would mean that EAP specialists are assigned to specific departments and even programs, where one of their responsibilities would be to prepare students for their first assignment. Ideally, as I said before, the EAP specialists would go with novice students through the processes of source use, using graphic organizers or other forms of note-taking. And only after the processes have been modeled, instruction should move on to the analysis of exemplars of the target genre. This sounds ambitious, and perhaps there will be never enough resources to provide this level of academic literacy support to all novice students. However, EAP is moving in the right direction. And in many universities, the attachment of EAP specialists to specific disciplines and departments is already in place. And those who are working in the disciplines will hopefully be encouraged by my talk to include a focus on writing processes into their teaching, which several of you may have already. Thank you very much for your attention, and I stop sharing the screen now.
Thank you so much, Ursula. That was absolutely fascinating. I think it's the very granular approach to your data collection that is so interesting. It really gives us a window into what your students were doing.